Welcome everyone to the chat that we're having tonight with Rabbi Tzvi Kahn. This is part of our ongoing series designed to bring Jews together from across the spectrum. And maybe one of these days we'll get a conservative or reconstructionist rabbi as well, but we have pretty opposite sides of the spectrum. We have Tzvi Kahn, who is an Orthodox rabbi, and you have me. They're still trying to figure out what I am, but it's kind of off on the other end of the spectrum. So I think, Rabbi Kahn, I'll leave it to you if you'd like to start out discussing the Torah passage, if you'd like, for this Friday, and then I'll share some thoughts too.
Thank you so much. The parsha is actually a very exciting Torah portion called Shemot. It's the first Torah portion in the book of Exodus, and so all of the famous stories about Moses and about the Jewish people being enslaved in Egypt and the whole story of their exodus from the land of Egypt, which is so central in our religion in terms of the holiday of Passover, and so central in the Torah, where it takes up so much of the narrative, and has always been something that is deep in the Jewish soul. The idea of being slaves in Egypt, and of God taking us out of Egypt and leading us to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, and then to the land of Israel, where, of course, the narrative of the Torah ends right before the Jewish people enter the land of Israel. But I would like to focus just for a moment or two on the personality of Moshe, which is, of course, the Hebrew name for Moses. And right off the bat, it's very interesting to note that Moses' name, the Torah tells us, is not a Hebrew name. It's an Egyptian name. He is called his Egyptian mother, who adopts him, who's a princess in the house of Paro, gives him the name Moshe, which connects to an Egyptian word or phrase meaning to be drawn out of the water. And I think that that's the first sign that we get that Moshe is a very unlikely savior of the Jewish people. His story, the story of his life, leads us in the opposite direction of what we would think in terms of what actually happens. It's highly unexpected and unusual for a person with Moses' antecedents and life story to become the savior of the Jewish people. And I think that's really
Oh, sorry. I hit the wrong button. Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
So
Don't worry, she does it to me all the time when I step out of line. You'll get used to it.
I don't know what I said or did wrong.
No, it was me. I'm sorry.
So, in what way is Moses an unlikely leader of the Jewish people? So, as we just said, he is not even raised in a Jewish family. He's born into a Jewish family, and then because there was a decree to kill the male babies, his mother puts him in the famous story of putting him in a little basket and floating him on the river. He's discovered by an Egyptian princess, and he's brought into the palace. And the Torah even says that later on, when he comes out of the palace to kind of to look around and to see what's going on, he's viewed as an Egyptian at that point. He himself identifies with his brethren, with the Jewish people, which is a very, very important point. But he's viewed as an Egyptian. And later in the story, when he flees Egypt, and he goes to Midian, the land of Midian, where he meets his wife Tzipporah, and he becomes the son-in-law of a very important, interesting figure named Jethro or Yitro. They identify him at first as an Egyptian. Tzipporah says, I saw an Egyptian man. So Moses really has this identity and in the external appearance of an Egyptian, which makes him, that's a very unusual start for a leader and a savior of the Jewish people. In addition to that, at the famous scene of the burning bush, Moshe, God says, I'm going to send you back to take the Jews out of slavery. And Moses says, I'm not a good speaker. I have kind of like a speech impediment. I'm not an orator. I'm not a speaker. I don't speak well. And so we also see that he doesn't have the normal characteristics that one would expect for a leader and a savior of the people to be. Certainly you would need a very polished, very articulate speaker, and he's kind of the opposite of that. And he lacks it seems if you put this all together, he really lacks charisma. We see that he doesn't seem to have much confidence. He's a very humble person. He keeps saying over and over again to God, I can't do this. I'm not going to be successful. They're not going to listen to me. They're not going to believe me. So I think when you put all of these pieces together, I believe what we're seeing and what the Torah wants us to see, I think, is that it was Moses's spiritual characteristics, and these grew over time, but it was his spiritual commitment and his commitment to his people and to God that led to his success. It was not his personal characteristics that were kind of natural or inborn, and it was not part of his life story. He didn't come from Jewish royalty, and he actually came out of Egyptian royalty in the sense of his adopted mother. But it was, when we want to understand Moses, we have to look to his spiritual qualities and his commitment, his incredibly profound commitment to the Jewish people, to his people, and to serving God. And when we put those two things together, we understand as those things grew over time, he grew into the role that was destined for him.
That's a wonderful analysis of the passage. And I, like Julius Caesar said, I came, I saw, and I concurred. I concur with Rabbi Kahn. And this is the passage that my son Ari read at his bar mitzvah. And it's a great passage because God reveals his name. And I remember, the name is Ehiyeh Asher Ehiyeh, which literally means I will be what I will be. I remember Ari, when he was doing his speech, Moses says, what's your name? And he says, I will be what I will be. And Moses says, hey, thanks for clearing that up. I really appreciate that. It doesn't seem to help out too much, but I think there's something to it, because perhaps the name is vague and ambiguous in order to indicate that this concept that we call God isn't something that you can just reduce to a name or a word or something that you can easily identify. And maybe when it says, I will be what I will be, it might reflect the fact that the concept has developed and grown along with the Jewish people and our understanding and our knowledge and our wisdom. And certainly science has helped us to know a lot about the world around us, and therefore to know the nature of the creative power behind it all. So the passage is fascinating in that the name's revealed. The other thing that's interesting, and it's not really a name at all, he's just saying, I will be what I will be. In other words, I'm not like you guys. I don't have a name. People don't go around calling me by my name. What's interesting also is that, and I want to ask you something about this, Rabbi Kahn, is that the Jewish people before him, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they never knew this name. This was something new that was unleashed on Moses. And the three patriarchs who had such a close identification with God never knew the name. Nor, of course, did people who were born before them, like Adam and Eve and all of them, they didn't know. So what it reveals to me is that this concept of God is ongoing. It's enlarging, it's expanding, and each generation gets a new insight and learns a little bit more. What we know today might not be as much as we're going to know tomorrow. And that's what's exciting about being Jewish, at least in a modern sense, is that this concept that is so inspiring to people is not limited to what our ancestors can conceive of or even what we can conceive of today. It's growing, and we don't really know what the concept will be like in 100 years or 1,000 years. But I did want to ask you, Rabbi Kahn, I've spoken to Orthodox Jews who insist that Moses was actually the first Jew, not Abraham. I always learned Abraham's the first Jew. God had a covenant with him, and so he was the first Jew. And then over the years, I've spoken to many Orthodox Jews who say, no, it wasn't Abraham. Moses was the first Jew. And I think the reason for that, well, my understanding of the reason, which might be different than yours if I got it right, and I don't know that all Orthodox Jews believe that, it's very, very clear in the Torah that Abraham did not keep kosher, because when the angels came to visit, it says specifically he went out and slaughtered a lamb, and then he served them cheese. So he's going around mixing milk or milkadik and meat. And so maybe they were perplexed by that, so they had to come up with a thing. Well, I guess he wasn't Jewish, so it doesn't count. It's okay that he did that because he wasn't Jewish anyway. We'll just start out with Moses. We don't have to worry about that issue. So there's a lot more to say about the passage, but I just wanted to ask you, Rabbi Kahn, first of all, is it your understanding, is that the Orthodox view that Moses was the first Jew, not Abraham? And if so, why was Abraham mixing milk and meat? And why is it that they consider Moses to be the first Jew, if that's the case?
Very, very interesting questions. Thank you for giving me a chance to respond to those things. First of all, I have never found, I guess I haven't spoken to the same folks you've spoken to, I've found a big school of thought in Orthodoxy that says we have to identify Moses as the first Jew. It was very common in my understanding and teaching from an early age until today, all these years later, that we view Abraham as the first Jew because of his unique identification of monotheism and of believing in one God, and of also passing that on to his children and inspiring his family and his followers to believe in one God and to reject idolatry. I think where that idea would come from, and it certainly has, this would be, I think, a very valid point to make, and maybe this is what those folks meant when they told you that, is that before the Torah was given, it's very hard to talk about Judaism. In other words, we can say Abraham was the first Jew, but if he wasn't given by God a set of, if he wasn't given the Torah, if he wasn't given the book that defines us and unites us as Jewish people, and then in what way was he really the first Jew besides his belief system? And so I think what they're saying is Moses as the person who not only was in the generation when the Torah was received by the Jewish people, but is the person who went up and received the Torah according to the narrative in the Torah itself. We view him as the first Jewish person because we can't separate Judaism from the Torah itself. And so those two things go together. But even if a person wants to make that point, I really feel there's absolutely nothing wrong with viewing Abraham as the first Jew and then Moses as the first halachic Jew, Moses as the first Jew in terms of the laws and the commandments, the recipient of the laws and commandments, and even the conveyor of the laws and commandments in the Torah. So I think the two things can fit together and be okay. It's just kind of focusing on different aspects of Judaism, the belief aspects of Judaism, the monotheistic aspects of Judaism, as opposed to the laws and the legal system of Judaism, which of course only formally came into existence with the Torah, with the giving of the Torah, which connects to Moses and not to Abraham. In terms of your question, it's really very interesting. In terms of your question about the milk and meat in Abraham, if you look at the story, you'll see that he serves, it says he brought the dairy and the cheese and things, and then in the next verse it says he brought the meat. So naturally the rabbis of the Talmud say, you see that? He gave them dairy first and then he gave them meat. He didn't mix them together, and etc. Also, technically speaking, and this is very rooted in Jewish law, there's no Torah prohibition. In the Torah itself, it does not prohibit a Jew from consuming meat and milk together. It consumes them from cooking meat and milk together and then eating it. So for example, if I had a hamburger and I had a glass of milk and I took a bite of the hamburger, I ate a couple of bites of the hamburger and I swallowed and then I drank the milk, I would not be violating Torah kosher laws. I would be violating rabbinic kosher laws, which tell us don't eat milk and meat together at all and keep a time separation between them. But according to the Torah, it's only when I take the hamburger and I cook it with butter or I put cheese on it and I cook it together. The Torah says if you cook meat and milk together, then you're not allowed to eat it. So Abraham, in that passage, Abraham comes out great. He comes out smelling like roses because he doesn't cook meat and milk together. He gives them meat and milk, that's true, but he doesn't cook them together. So I think Abraham's okay. Whether or not Abraham kept the laws of the Torah or many of the laws of the Torah is a big discussion and debate in the Talmud. There are those rabbis in the Talmud who say he did, and they point to certain stories in the Torah that seem to indicate that. There are other rabbis who say that he might have done certain things, but he didn't keep all of the laws of the Torah, because again, they were not given to the Jewish people until the time of Moses.
Well, how do you answer the question that if Abraham was kosher, why does he have ham in his name?
I can't do much with that. Abraham.
As far as Abraham serving the meat and then the milk, I have a feeling he didn't wait 3 hours, because according to the Torah, he was in a big hurry to serve his guests. He was running. He was like running to serve them. And so, unless he was a really, really, really slow runner, he probably didn't wait 3 hours between the two meals.
Yeah.
Also, I do always enjoy your explanations. I'm always fascinated to find out how people can try to reconcile the irreconcilable. But what you raise is a very interesting point about Torah kosher, because the Torah, just the Torah itself, doesn't even talk about separating milk and meat at all. It just says you shouldn't boil a calf in its mother's milk. It doesn't say anything about not serving milk and meat at the same time or anything like that. There's nothing like that in the Torah at all. So when you say it's not Torah kosher, the rules of the orthodoxy really, if you think about it, are man-made. Well, except you would explain it by the oral law, which you say comes from God. But from my perspective, a rational perspective, it's not in the Torah at all. These are things that human beings came up with over time, taking something in the Torah and expanding on it way beyond its original conception. And I think to try to avoid the snare of saying that humans created this, then they came up with this concept of the oral law. Oh, really? What happened was God whispered it to Moses, and he told Moses, oh, by the way, don't mix milk and meat either. And then Moses whispered it to Joshua, and so on. And then nobody bothered writing it down for, I guess, a couple of thousand years. But what you're talking about kosher, it's not in the Torah at all, right? The mixing milk and meat. That's not till you get to maybe when it first mentioned it was probably a couple of thousand years later in writing, right?
The Torah has a pretty extensive list of what Jews are supposed to eat and not eat, what we call the kosher laws. For example, which animals are kosher to eat and which animals are not, which fish are okay, which fish are not okay, which birds are okay, which birds are not okay. So that extent is pretty clear from the Torah itself, although we're not always sure because of the Hebrew language which animals or birds are being exactly referred to. So that's challenging sometimes. But you're absolutely right. The idea of not eating milk and meat together is not explicitly written in the Torah. And although there are many laws that are clearly written in the Torah, you're 100% right. From the perspective of Orthodox Judaism, we view the things that are explicitly stated in the Torah as kind of one of two steps. Then we have an oral, what we call, as you said, the oral tradition in which those things are explained. And the idea of not eating meat and milk that's cooked together is not mentioned in the Torah, but is viewed by orthodoxy as part of the oral tradition. The idea, however, of separating them and waiting between them is not viewed in orthodoxy as a Torah law of any kind, even according to the oral law. It's viewed as a later rabbinic enactment. In many parts of Judaism, according to, again, in the perspective of Orthodox Judaism, are rabbinic enactments that were never claimed to be part of the Torah. And that would be one of them, the idea of actually waiting between eating meat and eating milk, or keeping them separate to the degree that we do. That's clearly rabbinic and not part of Torah law, even according to the oral, even with the oral interpretation.
A few other things I just wanted to point out briefly about the Torah passage, which I find interesting. When you mentioned that the name Moses was Egyptian, a lot of scholars have pointed out that Moses in Egyptian actually means son of. And you could also interpret that to mean drawn out of, because the son comes out of the parents. But for instance, the name Ramses is the Egyptian god Ra, which is the sun god, which is, I think, where we get the word ray, like a ray of light. And then at the end of Ra, you have Moses, Ra, Moses, or Ramses. And Ramses means the son of the sun god. and that's how they translate in Egypt, Ramses. There were a lot of Egyptian pharaohs whose name ended with Moses, or M-O-S-E-S, or M-A-S-E-S, and it always means son of. So I think that's kind of interesting that he does have an Egyptian name. The Jews then found something in Hebrew to try to relate to it, and Moshe also means to draw out. And my father explained to me that Moses was drawn out of the water, but he drew out of the Jewish people their goodness and their kindness and their love. He took a people that had been embittered by slavery, and he drew out from them all these fine qualities, because that's what a leader does and a good teacher does. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Moses has a miracle birth, and this was kind of commonplace back in the old days. In the old days, any hero worth his salt always had a miraculous birth or a miraculous saving from death. So Moses, who was born at a time that the Pharaoh supposedly killed all the babies or the firstborn, this is a very common theme in ancient mythology. Many of the heroes somehow had some kind of miraculous birth, like Jesus was born out of a virgin, and Abraham's wife had a birth at 99 years old. So these things become rather commonplace. I also appreciate your explanation about Moses. He had a lot going against him, being a stutterer and not really raised Jewish and a Jewish household so much, but he still was able to lead the Jewish people. And I really like your explanation of it, that Jews believe that if you're inspired, it makes you eloquent, or it makes you a leader, or it makes you able to share great ideas with people. In fact, the word enthusiasm means God within. The theos, which is Greek for God, is where they get the word enthusiasm. So if you have a good cause or something that motivates you, it can take you over and you're just bubbling over with enthusiasm. It's like you have godliness in you and you can convince other people of it. So the other thing is that when he saw the burning bush, many people probably saw the same thing and didn't think anything of it. They just passed it by and it was no big deal. Moses was somebody who was observant and watching for miracles. So you could say it was bushert, that he discovered this miracle when other people didn't. And he saw the burning bush and he decided to share this miracle with others. And it's busheret because he decided to share it with other people. Moses was a great leader, and there's going to be more passages that we'll read about him. But I thought I'd just mention a few of those things in the Torah reading today, because there's just so much to say about Moses that we don't have to get into tonight. Rabbi Khan, is there anything else you wanted to mention about what's going on about that, or also Georgia? What's happening in Georgia? Go right ahead.
I'll get to Georgia in a sec, or we'll get to Georgia in a sec, which is an important event happening right now. But I wanted to mention one more thing from the Torah passage, and that is the roots of anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism, as we know, has unfortunately been with us for thousands of years. And really what we see in this week's Torah portion is that it's been with us from the beginning of the existence of the Jewish people, not in terms of Abraham, because we don't really see an anti-Semitism or a hatred of Abraham because he's a Hebrew. What we do see now of the Jews in Egypt is that the Pharaoh says to his people, we need to be suspicious of the Jews. We need to question their loyalty. They may not be as nice and as loyal as all the Egyptian citizens. They're foreigners. They're different. They may not have an allegiance to the country. And he specifically says, if Egypt is so strong, but if another nation, another power were to attack Egypt, the Jews might kind of be a fifth column inside the country. They live here, they're inside of us, and they might become traitors to the people. Well, that idea is so incredibly consistent throughout Jewish history, where almost everywhere that Jews lived, no matter how loyal they were to the country they lived in, at some point there would be people who would point to them and say, you can't trust the Jews. The Jews aren't really loyal. The Jews don't have allegiance to us. Their only allegiance is to themselves as the Jewish people. And I remember reading stories both about the First World War and the Second World War, where there were Jews who came showing their medals that they had served in the military of their country. So you had German Jews who had served in the German military in the First World War. You had French Jews who had served in the French military and the British military and so forth and so on. And it didn't help them. Those people who are anti-Semitic and are always seem prone to say, it doesn't matter what you've done, Jewish people, we don't really trust you. Bottom line, we don't trust you, we suspect you, and that leads to persecution. And the fact that that idea is so current today in some circles, and we see it in the Torah from 3,500 years ago, I think is very, very sad and unfortunate, but very powerful, very noteworthy.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Rabbi Khan. And also, we see that the Pharaoh, it says, and I think we discussed this last time, it says he knew not Joseph. So the Jews had built up the country, Joseph saved the country, and then he just forgot about it. That's a very common theme. The Jewish people make a country really powerful and prosperous, and then they just forget about the Jews and turn on them. And also, it says something interesting, that anti-Semites constantly invent things about the Jews to make them seem far more sinister and scary than they really are. Like in this passage, it says something like, these Jewish people are just multiplying out of all proportion. And it's like, there were these midwives, and before they could even get to the Jews to kill the babies, they were just coming out like grasshoppers. They were breeding like crazy. And it's just part and parcel of the anti-Semites to magnify and make up things about Jews that aren't true and make them a lot more scary than they are. Also, I just want to comment on what you said about the first Jew, and that the fact that some people think that, well, you have to have the Torah to be Jewish. Many of us think that that's not really the case, that the reason why Abraham was the first Jew is because, and like you said, it's his beliefs. Other people at his time saw the world as if there were a whole bunch of gods out there, and each people had their own god, and the gods were in conflict. And therefore, the nature of God is conflict and fighting. And therefore, human beings reflect what's going on in the heavens. And so the nature of human beings is to fight and to have conflict. And so the primitive peoples who believed in these concepts thought that fighting, conflict is just part and parcel of how the universe is made and how human beings are made. Abraham was different. I don't believe in a literal Abraham, but our ancestors conceived of someone who was the first one to say all of this is wrong, that everything we see around us bespeaks a unity and a harmony and a peace that it's kind of hard to see, but if you have faith, you can believe that this is what's going on. And science has actually borne that out and proven that he was right, especially with Einstein's unified field theory. The things that seem very disconnected are actually one. And therefore, the nature of the universe and the nature of human beings is unity and harmony and oneness and love. And that's what made him Jewish. All the Torah rules, they might mean something to some people, and some of them don't mean anything to anybody today. But what really made him Jewish is not that he followed a bunch of rules and commandments. What made him Jewish is that he viewed the world as one. He wanted to be a blessing, and he was trying to connect himself with this power, this unifying power, and to try to channel it. And he did it imperfectly. He was the first one, not the last, but he launched our people on this mission to try to share the unity and harmony of the world with other people. That's why he was Jewish. And for that, he didn't need the Torah. Let's open it up to other people. Unless you want to comment about Georgia. Do you have Georgia on your mind tonight?
I think everybody does, but let's open it up and hear what people
All right. Yeah, let's hear from other people.
Unmute.
Okay, so you can unmute yourselves. Go ahead, Harris. Unmute yourself first. We're a small Hamish group tonight. Go ahead, Harris.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I saw a little article that in Egyptian history, Moses was never mentioned, and I don't believe he ever lived. That's all I got to say.
Right. There's a lot of historians who hold that view. And I think that's a very plausible view. I think that the historical records from Moses and the Exodus are virtually non-existent. I hold the view that the Pharaoh named Echnatan might have actually been Moses or related to Moses. Moses was Echnatan, that means Anch, which is their god, and Adon or Aton, which is also a word for God. And Anch sounds like Anochi, which is how God referred to himself. And he was a monotheist like Moses was. And Semites came into the region at that time. So I think the story is rooted in mythology and doesn't really have a historical basis. But I don't think that takes anything away from the story at all, in that what the story reflects is something quite extraordinary that we venerate. And that is that somebody who is living in the comfort of the palace was not comfortable because other people were suffering. And rather than just enjoy his creature comforts, he couldn't be comfortable unless he helped lead other people out. And that's the story of the Jewish people. And that's true. Jewish people can't be comfortable if other people are suffering, no matter how good we have it. And that part of the story is 100% true.
Okay.
Just to comment, Harris and Rabbi, to respond to what you said. I'm not an archaeological scholar by any means, but I've tried to keep a little bit abreast of different writings and archaeology. It's my understanding that there are Egyptian records that talk about called the Abiru, or the Hebrews, and that there is evidence that the Hebrews were a community in Egypt, and possible evidence that points to them leaving en masse and leaving in a big group. The other, and there seems to be evidence that a group of people came into the land of Canaan, and that there were wars and things like that. It's also, I think it's always important when talking about archaeology, as the rabbi actually said a few moments ago about our knowledge constantly growing and expanding. You could point to any period in the past and look at the understanding of archaeology at that time, and we would go back and say everything they thought turned out to be wrong about a certain subject in archaeology because they hadn't yet found certain things. They haven't yet discovered certain things. I remember very well, I mean, even the time period of our own lifetimes, which, you know, is not in a historical sense is very short. During our lifetimes, things have been discovered, ruins of certain cities underground, coins, pottery, names, writings, things like that, that brought to light things that archaeologists had denied and said probably didn't happen. And then we saw that they did happen. Evidence of the first temple and evidence of a king named David, evidence of people mentioned in the Bible that some archaeologists said all of these people never really existed. And then evidence was found showing their names and their titles and their offices exactly corresponding in some cases to what was said in the Bible. So it's important to keep in mind whatever archaeology says at this moment, whatever this moment is, will change with new findings and will change with the next team that goes out and digs and uncovers, which might confirm previous findings or might add new light and shed new light on the situation. So I personally won't be surprised when they find evidence that Moses existed and led the Jewish people out of Egypt, but I know a lot of people will be surprised when that happens.
Well,
Thank you.
Rabbi Kahn is a man of faith, so he has faith that they're going to find that evidence. And I will agree with him that we can't rule out the possibility that one day they will find some evidence of Moses, but so far they haven't. And you would think that if the entire Egyptian army was wiped out by the parting of the Red Sea, it might exist somewhere in their records. It doesn't exist at all. And also the plagues were kind of significant. You would think that if these plagues really happened, if like all the firstborn were killed, all the cattle were killed, all the vegetation was destroyed, all of this happened, you would think there would be a mention. Now you could say, well, maybe they didn't want to mention the bad things. Maybe they wanted to cover it over, but it kind of strains credulity to think that all of this happened and there's no mention. I do agree with Rabbi Kahn. It's very interesting about the Egyptian records indicating a people called the Abiru, which seems very, very close to the Hebrews or Ivri. So I happen to agree with Rabbi Kahn that this is a fascinating discovery about this people, but of course it has nothing to do with the existence of Moses. And just because there was the Abiru doesn't mean that everything that the Torah says about the plagues and everything else is true. I do believe that there's very solid evidence based on the Biru and also the name Ivri, which gives rise to Hebrew, which means one who passes over or crosses over, that the Jews were nomadic and they wandered around different places and they probably ended up in Egypt. There are historical records that Semitic groups and the Hyksos invaded Egypt, took over the government, which would explain perhaps Moses and Ikhnaton becoming a monotheist. And then the native Egyptians took back control of Egypt and ended monotheism and then persecuted the people who supported that because they challenged the power structure. And so that fits in very well with the story of Joseph and Moses, where Joseph takes over and then the Egyptians came in and persecuted them. And it does fit in very nicely with the historical record. So I believe that there is good evidence that that type of thing could have existed. Emily, go ahead.
Outside of Cairo, there's a Coptic church, you know, the Egyptian church. And in the basement, they dug out, and under that is an Egyptian shrine. And under that was a Jewish temple of sorts. And this exists outside of Cairo. And, you know, we saw that and took a tour. That's number one. Number two, I always thought that the dietary laws were protect the Jewish people from eating things that were not good for them. Like you couldn't have bottom feeder fish because they were eating the bad things at the bottom of the ocean, and animals that had to chew their cud so that they would be cleaner than the pigs and stuff. I always thought that was science-based, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was just Borbimeisis. That's number two. Number three, 9% of the votes are in, and both Democrats are doing well, but you got to remember that's only Fulton County and Gwinnett County, which is surrounding Atlanta. They haven't got okay, that's it.
Go ahead, Rabbi Khan, you want to comment on that, what Emily said?
It's actually a very interesting point, Emily. Through the years, you know, through the ages, and the kosher dietary laws have been around for a long, long time. Through the ages, different rabbis have talked about the possible connections between health and cleanliness and the law and the dietary laws. And there do seem to be, and you've mentioned, you know, there does seem to be some kind of connection. However, if one looks at all of the dietary laws as a whole, it's very hard to make connections based on health for all of them. So it's possible that that's an element of it. And, you know, and from an Orthodox perspective, the idea would make perfect sense that God would want to protect the Jewish people from unhealthy things and eating unhealthy things. And of course, when they talked about pig, there used to be trichinosis and other things. So we like the idea of protecting, of having the dietary laws protect people health-wise, but kind of to make the case that all of the laws across the board have a basis in health that we would understand nowadays is not generally accepted as accurate. So there's in other words, there's more to it and more going on than just a connection to health reasons and cleanliness reasons, I think.
You know what, Rabbi Khan and I agree 100% on that as well. I think it's very possible that somebody ate something, maybe they ate pork and they died from trichinosis, and they said, God must not like eating pork, don't eat it anymore. And there might have been somebody who died eating something else, but that one they got wrong. You know, it was just a coincidence, but they understood it to mean God was angry at them. So some of the laws, I agree with Rabbi Khan, seem to have a rational basis, and other ones are just taboo that people just came up with along the way. There's a concept that I've heard of in the Orthodox tradition, which says that some of the rules specifically have no rational basis, and God wanted it that way to test us, like to figure out how loyal are these people? Will they do something that's really bizarre and crazy and makes no sense at all just because I said so? It's almost like you got Donald Trump who's testing the loyalty of people to see how far they'll go. But there is a line of thinking in Orthodoxy, like with the red heifer or the red heifer. You've probably heard about this, Rabbi Khan. It's like, this is a really obscure, bizarre procedure. You dip your finger in the blood and you do all these crazy things. And people have tried to understand, what's the reason for that? What possible rationale could there be? And I've heard some Orthodox scholars say, this thing is so crazy that there's no rational basis. There's no way that you could explain it by reason. And there's a purpose for that. God wanted the test to see whether Jews would follow even an irrational rule, so that he was testing their faith, kind of like he did with Abraham, but without the tragic consequences of his son. The other thing I wanted to comment on, Emily, is that when you mentioned that in Cairo, they dig down deep and they find a synagogue, a church, and then a synagogue. What's really fascinating is that during the Roman times, and even before Roman times, during the Greek times, the Egyptian religion really ceased to exist with the pharaoh worship. And so other religions came in, and Jewish people moved in to that area during Greek times, like Philo and Josephus. These were like, there were Greek-speaking Jews and there was Greek culture. We kind of overlooked this. But in Egypt, there were strong centers, like in Alexandria, of Jewish people who were living under Greek rule, and they had temples there. And these temples or synagogues could have gone back like 2,000 years or even beyond that, even during the Greek period. Then what happened when the Christians moved in, it's kind of like L'Dor Va-Dor wants to do. Starting a building from scratch, that's a lot of work. It's a lot easier to go find some church where they move out and they're not using it anymore and we can convert it into a temple. It's a lot easier. And so they would naturally look to a building like a synagogue and then convert it over. Not only that, some of the Jewish people became Christian or accepted Jesus and became polytheists, and maybe they did it. So that could explain how it got there. Who else wants to share some thoughts?
Valerie, go
Valerie.
ahead.
Well, I find it very interesting that, at some point, I think Rabbi Khan said something, and Rabbi Barry also, that it was at a later date that Moses received the Torah. I mean, once again, just like we did during Hanukkah, when you told me the 8 days with the burning oil had nothing to do with the actual Hanukkah, you kind of destroyed my childhood. Now you're telling me I saw Charlton Heston come down off of Mount Sinai with tablets and 10 commandments, and now you're telling me that's not really what happened. I mean, you're really blowing my mind here.
I hate to be a killjoy, but let me tell you what really happened. Okay, this is what really happened.
Okay.
God gave the commandments to Moses. Moses came down from Mount Sinai and said to the Jewish people, I got good news and I got bad news. The good news is I bargained God down to only 10 commandments. The bad news is that adultery is still in.
Laws down. I still can't figure that out.
I thought he got 20 commandments and he dropped one of the tablets. Oh, now we only have 10. No,
actually what happened was...
He threw one of the 10 tablets on the golden lamb. At least Charlton Heston did, and he spoke beautifully anyway.
No, what happened was Moses was up there so long, he started getting dizzy and lightheaded and had a headache. And God said, just take 2 tablets in the morning, you'll be fine.
I like that.
All right, anybody else want to share any comments?
This is great. It's great that we can laugh. Go ahead. You got to unmute yourself, Emily.
Oh, she's unmuted.
Talking about stutterers, you realize that Obama was a stutterer, and how people thought he was a very articulate speaker because he was inspired, and so that kind of follows what you were saying about Moses.
Yeah, kind of like Biden. Apparently, Biden was a stutterer also.
Yeah.
But it just confirms my story that I've mentioned before, that when Moses got out of Egypt and God said, where do you want to take these people? He was saying, can't. He was trying to say Connecticut, but God took him to Canaan instead because he stuttered. That's where I'm from. That's what we believe that in Connecticut very strongly. So I will just say that this is an amazing day. What's going on in Georgia is quite extraordinary, and it's going to really set the stage for what happens in the future. And many of us are just really hoping that it comes out the way that we like. But I would just say that what's really important is that we we join together and come together as one community, especially the Jewish people. The nation is exceptionally divided, and sadly, the Jewish people are too. I'm hoping that this type of dialogue and a new way of looking at things this year will help bring the Jewish people together, and maybe we can serve as a role model for other people, so that if we can join together, then maybe we can get other people to do so as well. And I wrote an article in the Jewish Journal about it, which you can actually find. It's online right now. If you go into the Jewish Journal, you can find it. And it's all about trying to bring about unity. And I started out the article by quoting one of the few politicians I actually care for, Alcee Hastings. And Hastings said, before he delivered a speech, he said, "I just want everybody to know, if I say anything to offend you, I just want you to know it's purely intentional." And what he meant by that was, he's not there just to say nonsense and what everybody wants to hear. He's there to speak his mind and to say what he believes to be true. And also, one of my other heroes is Christopher Hitchens, who's a brilliant atheist. And he said this, he said, "Some people say, I'm offended," as if that's an argument, as if, "Oh, you're offended, I guess I shouldn't have said that." He says, who cares? What's the difference? Does that have anything to do with what I'm saying is accurate? Is it true or not true? And I think we need to get off of our high horse and stop saying, "I'm offended, I don't want to hear this," or cancel culture where you can't say these things. I think we all need to be able to hear anything. And even if it's somebody that we really like, if a politician we think he's really good and somebody says something bad about him, get over it. Don't take yourself so seriously. Don't take these people so seriously. And that's part of what Judaism's about. We don't believe in idolatry and worshiping leaders. We believe in questioning leaders and challenging leaders and speaking out. So I think that what we are trying to accomplish here, something that my dad was doing so long ago, is to be able to disagree agreeably and get over it. Don't be offended. Like Rabbi Khan will say something I don't agree with. Who cares? That's part of the Jewish way. It's the dialogue of the Talmud. It's exchanging views. So I think this is a great way to launch this new year. I think we're very fortunate to have Rabbi Khan with us and to share with us of his wisdom, and also his ability to just have a very loving, unifying presence. The main thing that we need to focus on this year is Kalal Yisrael. That's the Jewish community. We are a community, and we need to be one. And a goal should be unity without uniformity, and community without conformity. If we can accomplish that, this is going to be a good year. Rabbi, those are my final comments. Rabbi Khan, I'll leave it to you to wrap us up.
Oh, thank you. I actually just wanted to circle back to one idea that you had mentioned before, the idea that in the Torah, some of the commandments don't have a rational basis. And
Right.
That is actually it's not a fringe idea, at least in Orthodoxy. It's not something that's considered bizarre or foreign or fringe. It's talked about in the Talmud, and those laws are called chukim in Hebrew, which in English they translate as statutes. And the idea is that the laws in the Torah in general can be divided into three categories. And one of those categories is called mishpatim, which means laws based in rational thinking and justice. So for example, do not kill, do not steal, don't, in other words, anyone who wanted to set up a successful society would put into place certain kinds of laws that would give them people a better chance to have a successful, harmonious society. And there are a lot of laws like that, commandments like that in the Torah, and those are referred to as mishpatim, judgment-based or rational-based laws. Another category is called adut, which means, or adot, which means testimonies, laws that bear testimony to certain historical events. So we eat matzah on Passover because we are remembering and commemorating what the Torah says was a historical event, the Exodus from Egypt. So there's lots of those kinds of laws. And then there are laws called chukim, which are these statutes that don't have a basis, that we would never make them up on our own. We would never think of them on our own, and they don't seem to provide that. And when the question is asked, and it's a very valid question, and it's the point you made, Rabbi, I think a few moments ago, well, why would that be part of Judaism, to have laws that don't seem to benefit society or to have a rational basis? One of the ideas one of the answers that's given to that question is that it kind of compare it to military training. In military training, there are many things that soldiers are taught to do, drill or things like that, that inculcates the idea of discipline and following, controlling yourself, learning how to discipline yourself and commit to do certain things and accomplish things that you beforehand would have thought maybe you wouldn't have been able to do. And so in Judaism, these statutes, these chukim, are ways to develop discipline and follow certain paths to show a dedication to God and to accomplish things that we might not have been able to even think we would be able to accomplish before. But there's obviously all kinds of opinions about that. But the main thing I wanted to say is that that's kind of readily conceded. That idea is readily conceded about laws in the Torah that don't have a rational, appear to have a rational basis.
I want to thank everybody for participating. I hope everybody is happy with the results of this election, and I hope that we're all going to commit to work together and join forces as one.